And only then I realize how much my freedom meant, when the searchlight from the gunboat casts its rays upon my tent.
In the late 1800s in South Africa, the Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers, were at war with the British colony. In 1902, the two parties accepted the diplomatic solution of forming a peace treaty, the Treaty of Vereeniging. The two Boer colonies, the Orange Free State and Transvaal, would fall under British rule, but the British would provide numerous amenities to the Boers. Shortly after, the Orange Free State, Transvaal, and the British settlers formed the Union of South Africa. When the Boers lost, a group of Boers called the Binnenlanders, who were frustrated with British rule, were elected to office and were a main proponent of the apartheid in South Africa. This Boer rule over South Africa led directly to the creation of the apartheid.
Now, who exactly are the Boers? They were a group of people who descended from early Dutch settlers in South Africa. Those Dutch settlers originally landed on the Cape Colony in 1652 as a merchant outpost for the Dutch East India Company, an influential corporation that essentially monopolized trade. In 1806, the British gained control of the Cape Colony. The Boers living in the Cape resented certain British rules, such as the abolition of slavery. These rules led to the Great Trek in 1835. This was a period where Boers migrated inward into South Africa and formed two separate nations, Transvaal and the Orange Free State. After around 40 years, there was still a lot of tension in South Africa. Specifically, there are three main causes. First, all three nations, Transvaal, Orange Free State, and the British, had claimed a newly discovered gold mine as their own. Secondly, almost the entirety of southern Africa was colonized by different European nations: Portugal and Angola and Mozambique, Belgium and DRC, Germany and Namibia, and more. Britain was worried another colonial empire would get to the Boer nations before they could. Finally, the main source of tension were the Zulus. The Zulus were an aggressive, warlike tribe inhabiting South Africa, and the Boers were afraid they were eventually going to invade their land.
The Zulus had a pretty complex relationship with the British and Boers, especially since the Zulus are indigenous to the South African land, and, of course, the British, on their quest to colonize and Christianize the world, meddled with the Zulu people. But that's a story for another time.
The British annexed Transvaal in 1877 with the excuse of protecting the Boers from Zulus. All these tensions exploded and eventually led to Transvaal's rebellion, also known as the First Boer War.
The war officially began on December 16, 1880. A notable early battle happened on December 20th, when an advancing group of British soldiers was told to turn back as their advance would violate Transvaal's newly declared independence. They did not, and the Boers quickly opened fire. In 15 minutes, 156 British soldiers were dead, and soon after, over 100 more were captured. The Boers only lost 2 soldiers. This, the first battle of the Boer Wars, called the Battle of Bronkhorstspruit, would foreshadow how much the British would underestimate the Boers throughout the war. In late December that same year, the Boers began to invade many British garrisons. This is what the British called the Transvaal Rebellion. The British stationed troops atop a hill and prepared for an attack. The battle began with the Boers trying to climb the side of the hill. Thanks to their superior aim, they managed to claim an elevated area called Gordon's Knoll. After taking Gordon's Knoll, the Boers advanced to surround the British or force them off of Majuba Hill by taking the high ground and shooting at the British troops on the open plateau. At this point in the war, the British were losing many troops and land with every battle, and the Battle of Majuba Hill was the last straw.
After this crushing defeat for the British, Transvaal and British representatives signed peace treaties on March 23, 1881. This was a pivotal loss for the British, as this was their first defeat in a streak of 28 won wars in a row. The Boers' success in this war was mainly caused by their unique army and high mobility. Instead of having conscripted troops, when soldiers were needed, every man from 16 to 60 years old would join together in a militia, democratically elect generals, and go to battle. Every Boer would bring their own weapons, steed, and meals. The Boers were very skilled marksmen, even on horseback, and retreated and attacked incredibly quickly. In 1886, after the First War, a reef of quartz was discovered full of gold in Transvaal. After 12 years of mining it out, Transvaal had gone from being one of the poorest countries in the world to one of the richest. But because of a failed revolt 3 years prior, the country was in disarray, and war was becoming increasingly likely. In 1899, as a final attempt to avoid such a thing, a council was held between the presidents of Transvaal and the Orange Free State, but it was unsuccessful, and Britain began sending soldiers down to Transvaal. Transvaal offered an ultimatum for them to stop, but upon its end on October 11, 1899, war was declared.
As one of the first major events of the war, the Boers invaded 4 spots in Cape Colony on November 1st. Lives were lost on both sides and everyone seemed to be in confusion. This was one of a few failed attacks by the Boers in early November. Meanwhile, Bloemfontein was suffering through a lack of water supply and sanitation, in addition to the typhoid epidemic sweeping through. Over the course of the war, Britain lost over 10,000 troops to typhoid, more than half of their total casualties. In September 1900, the British established the first 2 concentration camps in Pretoria and Bloemfontein. From then until their end in 1902, 48,000 people died in concentration camps, including 1/6 of the total Boer population. The camps were said to be for the safety of those encamped, but that did not last. People were taken against their will to areas riddled with disease and died a good portion of the time. The real intention of the camps was to stop Boers from resisting British control. Though they were originally made for Boer soldiers in need of shelter, they were eventually heavily outnumbered by women and children whose houses were burned down by the British, who enacted laws allowing them to destroy the properties of Boer civilians. The laws evolved from one homestead for every railway attack to the British simply destroying entire towns. Almost every Boer home was destroyed, 30,000 in total, not to mention the killing of thousands of livestock. But all of this was costing the British a lot, and nearing the end of the war, they were spending about $350 million per day in today's money. Despite Britain's financial hardship, the Boers were not in a good situation to win the war through the loss of their people and homes, and officially surrendered on May 31st, 1902.
In the end, Britain had spent about $35 billion in today's money overall, the most expensive war they had ever fought, and nearly 500,000 soldiers had served. In order to end the Second Boer War, the Boers and British signed a treaty called the Treaty of Vereeniging, which took away Transvaal and Orange Free State's newfound independence, but still left them with the right to some self-governance. In exchange for their independence, the Boers got around $511 million after inflation to repair, and both Transvaal and Orange Free State got a capital to represent them in the Union of South Africa, in the form of Pretoria for Transvaal and Bloemfontein for the Orange Free State, alongside Cape Town for the British. Additionally, since the Boers were such a formidable opponent to the British, Britain realized they needed to enact certain new regulations for the military and provide new equipment. This helped Britain greatly while fighting in the First World War.
After creating the Union of South Africa, some Boers were restless. The new British rule forced them to sign a treaty which held them to the laws set by the British and prevented them from forming a rebellion. Some Boers didn't sign this treaty and were forced out. Later, some of those Boers came back once signing the treaty was no longer necessary and formed a group called the Bitter Yenders. Those bitter Yenders launched a xenophobic political party called the National Party, which was on the rise in the 1940s. Their rise to power can actually draw comparisons to the Third Reich. Their influence started out slow, but grew exponentially as racist ideas developed throughout citizens' minds. The National Party began to implement their racist and segregationist policies in 1948. This was known as the Apartheid. The South African apartheid included laws and restrictions such as designated areas for certain races, the illegalization of biracial marriage, and the racial classification of non-Europeans.
To recap, around the turn of the 20th century in South Africa, the Boers had a tenuous relationship with the British colony. In 1902, after 20 years of battle and unease, a peace treaty was formed. The Boer nations would succumb to British rule, but the British would provide them with essential resources. A few decades later, a group of Boers called the Bitter Yenders emerged, and their steady rise to power and influence in the 1940s launched South Africa into a racist regime called the Apartheid. The Bitter Yenders started out as veterans of the Second Boer War, and their defeat only fueled them into forming the Apartheid. Through a century of warfare and diplomacy, of high tensions and grueling debate, the Boers paved the way for the creation of South Africa's apartheid, the beginning of the bitter end.